that not so long ago, before I was a priest, I was a paramedic for the Baltimore County Fire Department. What some of you might not know is that when I'm lucky, I still get a chance once or twice a month to ride the ambulance as a paramedic up for the Hereford Volunteer Ambulance Association. And while that's great, it lets me keep my certification and it provides a certain kind of sabbatical, a different way of being and serving. It does also provide me with an awful lot of time to watch television. See, up in Hereford, people call 911 when they really need it. In fact, sometimes a little bit after they really needed it. And so, while I get some good calls up there, or at least good for my experience, I spend a lot of time sitting and watching shows I might not otherwise ever consider that I should watch. And last week, just as I was pondering today's gospel, I watched this sitcom that's sort of a cross between Gilligan's Island and the show, that drama that was on a few years ago, Lost. It's basically a funny version of a whole bunch of people who crashed on a desert island and they're trying to live together. And the episode that I watched revolved around that one of them had found a DVD player that had just enough battery life left for one movie. But it did not have a movie in it. And so they had to go digging through the luggage of those who had not been as fortunate in the crash as them, and they found 2 DVDs that were both clearly pirated, which I thought was funny too. And the 2 movie options were Dumb and Dumber 2 or Selma, the great Academy Award-winning drama about the civil rights movement and Dr. King. This engaging but also gut-wrenching and heart-tearing film that everyone in the show said to each other, I always meant to watch that, it's so important. And the whole episode is them trying to balance this moral idea that they're trapped on an island. All they really want is 2 hours of escapism, but they also have this opportunity to watch this incredibly important and epic thing that they feel compelled to. And I'm not going to ruin how it plays out. There's lots of gags in it. It's actually pretty funny. But it also helped me figure out what might, I'm not entirely certain, be going on in this morning's gospel story. You see, today Jesus is asked by this complete stranger on the side of the road to advocate for him with his brother, to demand that the stranger's brother divide their family's inheritance between them. So first, a little bit of context, a little bit of how things were in Bible times. We're going to assume that the stranger was the youngest or the younger brother, because the oldest male would inherit the entirety of the estate for the most part. And it was his responsibility to keep the family together, to provide for younger siblings and their wives and their children. And if a younger sibling wanted to go off, sort of like the younger son in the parable of the prodigal son, if that son wanted to go off on their own, they would have to negotiate with that older brother that we're going to liquidate a portion of the estate, and I'm just going to take it in cash and go off and do whatever with it. And that's sort of what he's asking Jesus to advocate for. And I think it says something about sort of the radical and wild nature of Jesus' ministry, that it was just assumed that Jesus would overturn whatever was normal because that's what he was kind of going around and doing. Now, of course, Jesus, as Jesus is wont to do, neither does what is asked of him, nor provides a straight answer. He doesn't say, of course you're right, bring your brother here, nor does he say, you know, your brother's right, go do what's normal. Instead, he offers this prohibition against greed. He says, you know, beware greed in all of its forms. And just when you think maybe we're off the hook, Jesus goes full Jesus, as I like to say. And he stops and he tells everyone who is present a story, a parable, to try to illustrate what's important that's going on here. And the parable that he tells is kind of a bit tough for me to swallow, because I can't figure out exactly what the poor old guy did that was particularly foolish. I mean, there's this rich guy and he has a bumper crop, he's very lucky, and he doesn't squander it. He stores it away, and he builds a bigger storage facility. He puts it all up in there, and he sits back and he says, how lucky I am. I'm just gonna coast for a while. I've got things stored up. And then God comes to him and says, you fool, tonight you're gonna die, and who's gonna get all your stuff? And I can't figure out exactly what's going on here, because not only does it contradict common sense that we should store up more than we need, that it is responsible and safe not to outspend ourselves, but it also seems maybe to contradict some of Jesus' own teachings, that we're supposed to stop and take time away and recuperate so that we don't damage our relationship with God, that we don't burn ourselves up. And if the guy's going to die anyway, what does it matter? He's going to be dead. His stuff's going to go to someone. And wouldn't the greater sin have in fact been for him to just keep working and make oodles more money and just keep stowing it away and never stopping to enjoy life and to have gratitude? So these are the things that I was dealing with as I sat at Hereford in front of the television. And luckily, I was given these two hints. The first one comes from this story. So first, let's go back and remember who got us into this mess in the first place by asking Jesus a question that would lead to a story, as it always does. This younger brother, like the brother in the parable of the prodigal son, wants to get away. He wants to have a portion of the family's estate liquidated so he can go off by himself, free of the discomforts and entanglements and responsibilities that come with being a member of his household. He wants to have it his way and not be bothered. And the funny plot from the sitcom kind of takes this a step further in a comedic way. They're exploring whether it is better to use our resources to check out, to cut ourselves off from the difficulties of life with something that balms our ragged nerves and gives us a comfortable and unchallenging, perhaps escapist experience. Or are we called to embrace those things that challenge us, force us to engage with the difficulties in the world, and should we allow ourselves to be made uncomfortable? Now, let me be very clear. I doubt there's anything particularly sinful about occasionally watching trash television or B movies. But it would appear that Jesus would like to weigh in. The privilege that the rich man in the parable seems to feel he has earned is the right to disengage from the messiness, the struggle, and the hassle of the world. We have to read between the lines here, but there's a sense that he is eating, drinking, and being merry in isolation, away from his neighbors, away from his communities. Those outside his doors may be starving. There may be turmoil and catastrophe in his community. His friend's child, who he was a role model to, may be wondering where he went off to. But he has struck it rich, and whether he was blessed by a bumper crop or is very smart and read the weather and clevered his way into being wealthy, it's irrelevant. He is going to use his riches to recline and relax and let the problems of the world pass him by. And I think what we're getting out of the gospel today is that for Christians, that's not okay. Christ is constantly calling us into the messiness of human life. Go, stranger, says Jesus, live and work and love your brother. Don't be a fool, rich man. See how the wealth I have trusted you with can help others and improve your life by building up everyone around you. And while you're at it, watch the bloody movie that makes you think about racism and reflect on how hard fought the way to here has been, and might just leave you uncomfortably aware of how far we have left to go. The thing is, though, I don't know about you, but I can relate to the rich man and the brother and the person who wants to watch Jim Carrey and Dumb and Dumber 2, because he's a genius. Since Ari and I moved to Baltimore 8 years ago, I have often been overwhelmed by the social challenges of this part of the world. I grew up in a part of Michigan in which systemic racism was very well hidden. there wasn't that much racial diversity to begin with. And when I worked with the homeless in Kalamazoo, there were so few chronically homeless people that I knew almost all of them by face and name. If I were to write a list of all of their names, I'd only need 1 or 2 pages of college ruled paper. Since coming here and marching in protests and joining interfaith and interracial conversations about communities that were left behind in the economic booms of the 20th century, I have learned more and seen more, understood more, and cared more about those different from me than I ever could have in 3 lives, back where I grew up and where things made sense in Michigan. And I am certain that here, right now, is where God wants me to be, and where I am as useful as I can be to my Creator. But I still dream and imagine an awful lot about going back to where I grew up, where things seem safer, more comfortable, where the world makes sense, and where the solutions to all the problems just seem right around the corner. And to explore that a little bit, I'm going to throw into the mix this morning's passage from Ecclesiastes. Now, Ecclesiastes may be the weirdest book in the Old Testament, and that is saying something. Scholars really have no idea what it's doing there. They debate on that. They have debated it for well over 2,000 years, in fact. It is part of the canon of the Hebrew Bible, and it is this weird kind of Plato-esque philosophical treatise, except that rather than sort of being clear and having an arc, the person who is the author, it's written, everyone knows that it's a fictional narrative written by a philosopher as an illustration, and the author is supposed to be this king who goes around his kingdom trying to develop philosophy. The problem is that he contradicts himself like every other page. It's very hard to get our head around. And today's lectionary this morning offers this: deeds that are done under the sun, and see all is vanity and chasing after the wind. And that's hard to figure out. But I think, in light of today's gospel, we might be able to make some sense of it. You see, I think the vanity that he's talking about is the same vanity that made the person in the gospel want to have his own way. And it's probably the same vanity that made Adam in the garden think, that apple looks mighty tasty. It's the vanity of being sure that we know how it's supposed to be, what we deserve to get, what we have the right to, and perhaps the duty, frankly, to become alarmed by during those times when our lives, as we want them to be, veer off course. There's a great episode of The Simpsons where Lisa Simpson has to deal with a substitute teacher. And when the substitute teacher is not living up to her expectations, she says, well, you're supposed to do this, and you're supposed to do that, and I'm supposed to do this, and I'm supposed to do that. And the substitute teacher looks at her and says, Lisa, it looks like someone's got a bad case of the spostas. Everyone experiences pain in life. But a lot of it comes when we compare what is going on against what we think is right and fair. This is one of those times when Christianity and Judaism and Zen Buddhism really all seem to be drinking from the same pitcher of Kool-Aid. It isn't to say that we don't experience honestly terrible things, but when we add to our pain the illusion that we are being punished by God or being denied by God something that we are justly owed, it adds anger and bitterness to our sadness and makes things a lot worse. Frankly, it's vanity for me to imagine that where I grew up in Michigan was somehow this utopic microcosm where everything just works out. The truth is, I've been sent here to minister. This is where God wants me to be. The problems that I encounter day to day are the ones that I get to work with on behalf of my Creator. And the things that I have to see and experience, they're just what's there. And part of my job is to experience that pain, and I only make it worse for myself and others if I whine about it to myself, or if I think that somehow God is acting unjustly or sabotaging. And frankly, I think that this sense of vanity applies a little bit to the way that we might do church in the 21st century. You see, the people who started the church, the Desert Fathers, there weren't mothers at the time, but the Desert Fathers would probably look at the way that we do church right now. When they did church in these isolated pits and basements, huddled together in the darkness. And in their vanity, they would think we were doing it completely the wrong way. All of this Romish imperialistic nonsense would just blow their minds. And I tell you what, I don't know what church is going to look like 50, 60, 100 years from now, but I bet those of us who would be looking down at it are going to look at it when it's this post-imperial thing where all the things that make society what it is aren't wrapped up in what we do here. And we're probably going to look down the barrel at it and think, what's going on there? That's not the way I did it. That's not the way my parents did it. But as disciples, we're going to have to accept that the church that our parents and grandparents built for us may not be the church that our children and our children's children need to build them up as disciples. In Ecclesiastes, there's this wonderful line that says, I hated all my toil in which I had toiled under the sun, seeing that I have to leave it to those who come after me. And who knows whether they'll be wise or foolish? And yet they will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. And then the author turns on himself and says, this is vanity and great evil. We do what we can where we can do it. So one last story to end on a happier note, I hope. When I was 22 years old, I had a great job. I was the Special Projects Coordinator for the Residential Option Arts and Letters at Michigan State University, which basically meant that my job was to take college students and put them in weird situations. Best thing I ever got to do. And I would do alternative spring break trips. And one year I got to take a whole bunch of college students who were my own age. I mean, I'm one of them at the time, to go to Taos, New Mexico to build Habitat for Humanity houses. And one of the guys who came along was the last person I would have ever expected to come with us. He was very cynical, very, the world's a rough place, and just not the kind of person who I would have thought would sacrifice his spring break chill time to go build these houses. But he was hilarious, and I loved him, and I still enjoy whenever I get to talk to him. And he came along, and having him with us was great. But then one day came where we had to partner up with people who knew what they were doing to build these adobe houses. And, people went off to build the bricks or went off to dig some holes. I went off, I think my job that day was to hit myself in the fingers with a hammer as many times as I could while sobbing softly to myself. But at the very beginning of the day, he got paired with a guy who we thought was another volunteer, didn't speak a lot of English, and was just as different from us as we could possibly be. And it was just random, but I could see the look on his face. The eyes were rolled, the shoulders were hunched, and there was some sighing. And off he kind of went with this person. But over the course of the day, there was a progression. And, I could kind of see him perking up, and they were really having a good time going back and forth. And when lunchtime came, I said, hey, you want to come have lunch with us? And my friend was like, no, we're going to work through lunch. We're going to have a snack. It's going to be great. And at the end of the day, these guys were working like hand in glove. And he introduced his new friend to the rest of us. And what we didn't realize was that this guy, whose English skills were, better than we thought, but still challenged, was the owner of the house. You see, in Habitat for Humanity, you put in sweat equity to get this house for your family. And no one ever points out who that person is. They're just with the rest of the crew. And this was, our new friend. But what's important about it is that all the energy and the resources and the time and the emotional energy that we spend avoiding those things, those realities, and those people that make us uncomfortable, that energy makes it harder for us to hear the voice of God in our lives. God comes to us in those moments, in those people that challenge us, and that's one of the main ways in which God speaks to us. So sometimes we got to second guess ourselves, our first impulse, the half of us that isn't particularly divine and made in God's image, is to go where it's comfortable and safe. And we are invited by today's gospel story, by the book of Ecclesiastes, and by the show Wrecked, which I believe is on TNT, to think twice before moving away from those things that scare us. Because to move towards them may also be to move towards God. Amen.
Amen.